Well, it looks like we're live again on the Atheist Forum. Hi, welcome to tonight's show. I'm Joe Reinhardt for Atheists of Florida, and tonight we're going to be talking about values voters. This is a topic that I am very hopeful that we'll be getting lots of phone calls from our viewers, because in spite of the fact that I hear the phrase values voters about 50 times a day, at least if you've been following the campaign up to next Tuesday's election, you'll hear it about 50 times a day. And in spite of that, I haven't got the faintest idea what it means. So hopefully there'll be lots of people out there who can call up and enlighten us on exactly what kind of values are we talking about. What are value voters and family values? You know, we did a show a few weeks ago on family values, and I want to reissue that offer, and that is I'm also inviting any viewer who would care to call in and tell us about, one or two families in the Bible that we might use as a model, as a paradigm for family values here in the world today, that we might want to pattern our own families after the types of families that we see in the Bible. So if anyone out there would like to give us a call, just one or two will be fine. You don't have to come up with a whole handful, but I'd like to know a little bit more about what kind of families are there in the Bible that so interest us, and that would be a good example for a person today to follow their example and raise their families in the same way. Now, of course, with the election virtually upon us, the end is near, I thought we might tie in our topic of family values and values voters with basically a group of people who have, at least for the last 10 or 12 years, held themselves up to the public as being paragons of virtue, as being examples of morality, as being the party of morality. And of course, I'm talking about the repugnant party, the Republicans. And I have about a 10-page list here of repugnants that I'd like to go over to sort of start off the show. I want to, it's not our definition for this evening, but I want to introduce our audience. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this word, and that is Schadenfreude. You know, Schadenfreude is a German expression for a person who gets, in a sense, a comeuppance or his own just deserts. A good example, and when I first saw the word, in fact, was Tony Blair, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. He said that, these public drunks and these thugs ought to be arrested right on the site, taken to the nearest ATM, fined £100, and then thrown in jail, or something to that effect. Within 48 hours, they arrested his, I think, 16-year-old son for public drunkenness, vomiting in the public street, false ID, and lying to a police officer. That, my friends, is as good an example of Schadenfreude as you're ever going to find. But it turns out that the Republican Party, when you set yourself up as a paragon of virtue, you do set yourself up to a fall. Pride cometh before a fall. And it turns out there is a long, long list of people who have campaigned actively under the family values aegis, and who have been in the forefront of those who were ready to impeach Bill Clinton for his indiscretions in office. And it turns out that many of these people do not have nearly as clean hands as they would like you to believe. I want to cite a couple of examples here. Let's start with Dick Armey. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Dick Armey. He's not in the Congress anymore, but he's a former professor and was in the U.S. Congress. He's been accused, and it was published in the Dallas Observer, of sexually harassing female students. He has a rather, I thought it was funny actually, quote where he says, "Yes, I'm Dick Armey, and if there is a Dick Armey, then Barney Franks will want to join it." That's one of his better known quotes. Jim Baker, certainly a well-known figure and a staunch conservative. I don't have to go into his problems with paying several hundreds of thousands of dollars from charitable funds to cover up an adulterous relationship with Jessica Hahn. Here's one of my favorites, Bob Barr. This is great. Let's see here. Excuse me 1 second while I get up the piece of paper that I want. Here we go. Bob Barr was a pretty well-known politician in Georgia, a Republican. He was a major opponent of freedom of choice. He publicly stated he would do everything in his power to stop a family member from having an abortion, even if the pregnancy were a result of rape. His ex-wife, Gail, says that her then hubby, Bob Barr, whom he's now divorced from, had actually condoned the abortion of her third pregnancy, and he personally paid for it. So in Thanksgiving of 1985, he dumped his first wife, Gail. In fact, she was recovering from cancer at the time. He abandoned their two sons for his, third wife, Jerry. He swore he wasn't having an affair before divorcing his wife, Gail. Here's the punchline. Bob Barr was the chief sponsor of the Federal Defense of Marriage Act. He was photographed licking whipped cream off the breasts of strippers, and he was the first representative to call for the impeachment of President Clinton. Let's see. I see. He was married 3 times, and his office will confirm that, which raises the question of why the Defense of Marriage Act doesn't contain a 3 strikes and you're out provision. That's a quote from Frank Rich of the New York Times. And here's one from the Marriage Magazine, which is Robert Barr, who wrote the act, the Defense of Marriage Act, Federal Defense of Marriage Act. It definitely supports the notion of marriage, why he's been married 3 times. He must have confused the till death do us part with the till divorce do us part. And here is a little suggested Bible reading for Mr. Barr, which is Malachi chapter 3, verse 5. And I will come near to you to judgment, and I will be a swift witness against the sorcerers, and against the adulterers, and against false swearers, and against those that oppress the hireling in his wages, the widow and the fatherless, and that turn aside from the stranger from his right, and fear not me, saith the Lord of hosts. I have a pretty long list here. I don't want to spend the entire evening going through this list. Some of these people are probably not very well known. Others are quite well known, like Randall Terry. Many of you may have heard of him, if only from the Terry Schiavo debacle. One of his sons is overtly, openly gay. He's disowned him for that. He was also censored by his church for adultery. But we'll get to him in due time. I see the phones are starting to ring, so be patient. I got 1 or 2 more people on the list here that I want to talk about, which ought to really spur some people to action. Gary Bauer, who is still well known in the religious right, very active in the religious right. He was the former policy advisor under Reagan, a Bush II advisor, president of the Family Research Council, and an anti-gay crusader. 9 of his staff members quit in protest because he was shacking up with a 26-year-old deputy campaign manager, and they spent a good deal of time, even spent the night together in hotel rooms with the door closed, and so on and so forth. He says, we are engaged in a social, political, and cultural war. There's a lot of talk in America about pluralism, but the bottom line is, somebody's values will prevail, and the winner gets the right to teach our children what to believe. Apparently that would include shacking up in a hotel room with a campaign manager, at least according to Gary Bauer. Now, before I go to the phones, and again, just bear with me for just a second, I want to get to some better-known people. Oh, here's one right here. George H.W. Bush, that would be George Bush the first. He has, for many, many years, been associated with a woman by the name of Jennifer Fitzgerald. And the president says that he's not going to answer sleazy questions like that, even though CNN actually asked him the question as to whether or not he had been carrying on an affair with her. And he said that he is not going to respond to it, which is not exactly a denial. And in fact, there's an extensive series of reports in the New York Post alleging that a former U.S. ambassador, a man now deceased, had told several persons that he arranged sexual trysts between George H.W. Bush and female staffers in Geneva. Here's an even better one, and then I'm going to take our first phone call. And that would be a guy by the name of George W. Bush. He's a failed businessman, son of the 41st President of the United States and the current occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. The list of immoralities that Mr. Bush has perpetrated against the citizens of the United States is a little bit too long to go into now, but I do want to mention that he was, let's see, he was sued by one Tammy Phillips for an affair which reportedly began in 1997 and ended in 1999. And I think he was also involved in a criminal suit involving a woman who committed suicide as well. I'm sorry that I don't have that documentation in front of me, but I'll look it up here in a minute and we'll definitely go on to that. Anyway, let's go ahead and take a phone call. It's a live call-in show. Our theme for tonight is family values and value voters, and we're hoping that you can tell us exactly what is a values voter. Go ahead.
Hey, how you doing?
Fine, thank you.
I just had a question. I wanted to know your outlook and all on gay marriage, like in your personal opinion.
My personal opinion?
Yes, sir.
I couldn't care less. If two people are attracted to each other and they want to spend their lives together and they want to get married, at least in terms of the
just being together.
In terms of the civil contract, I have no quarrel with that at all. And in fact, if they want to be officially married, I would endorse that, although I can't for the life of me understand why anybody who is gay would want to be a member of a Christian church, since the Christian Bible is pretty clear that they must be stoned to death, Leviticus 13.
You got that right.
And so, to me, a gay person wanting to be have a marriage sanctified by a church would be sort of like a black person wanting to have their marriage sanctified by the Ku Klux Klan.
Oh my goodness!
I don't understand the attraction, but frankly, I haven't any interest in what other people do with their genitalia. That's up to them, and I don't think it's the business of the government to interfere in that. And if a church doesn't want to perform marriages for people who are openly gay, fine. They don't have to. I'm sure there are plenty of churches that will.
Do you know if that's legal right now in Florida?
Florida has a specific law against it, and they are proposing a constitutional amendment.
Oh, okay. Well, I appreciate your information today, buddy.
All righty. Thank you for calling.
All right, baby.
Okay. So let me repeat myself. Our topic this evening is value voters and family values. We're trying to clarify, what do these phrases mean? Frankly, I think they're pretty hollow. The most I can tell when I look into this even cursorily is that when they're talking about family values, they're talking about things like gay marriage. They're talking about women's rights. They're talking about abortion. They're talking about reproductive rights in general. At what age you might become sexually active, or at what age they think your children ought to become sexually active, not just theirs. And in fact, it seems to me that the entire gist of this family values argument is that there's one group of families who think that they have the overwhelming right to tell your family how to live, to tell your wife what her reproductive practices ought to be, to tell you who you can or cannot have a long-term relationship with, whether intimate or at any level in some cases. To me, this is the most anti-American thing I can think of. It's certainly the opposite of conservatism, that you should demand that other people live as long as you think they ought to live, that you should make demands on the legal executor of a person who is totally incapacitated, and I'm talking about Terry Schiavo here, that your opinion on whether or not life support should be removed from his wife is more important and overrides his opinion, his legal rights to do so. So to me, in a nutshell, it seems like family values is just a euphemism for I want to tell your family how to run their lives. Now, I'm not against people lobbying for that idea. I'm not against people trying to persuade others to forego an abortion or to practice various kinds of birth control or what have you. But I am very much against the idea that if they can't convince you to come around to their point of view, that they want to go to the legislature and the police and have them do it for them. This is un-American. This is extortion. This is totalitarianism. It's the exact opposite of the freedom to run your life the way you want to run it. And the exact reverse is true when it comes to them. They get very upset if you don't want them to put their 10 Commandments in your courthouse. And they get very upset if you don't want your children to have to stand there while their children pray. So it seems to me that if you have a right and you claim it for yourself, it's just the height of hypocrisy to deny someone else the right that you seem to think that you have for yourself. Censorship's a perfect example of that. A person uses his freedom of speech to suggest that someone else doesn't have freedom of speech. All right, so I have given you a little rundown on what I think is a good definition of family values. I have some other examples here that I'm going to read one or two of. Nelson Rockefeller, curiously enough, three-time failed presidential candidate, adulterer and divorcee. In fact, he and his wife were both married at the time that they divorced their respective spouses to marry each other in 1962. Leviticus 20:10 is pretty clear on that, and that is that both the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. He wasn't put to death, but he did run for president. Suggested Bible reading it's an interesting, I forgot. Rockefeller supposedly, when he died in 1979 in the midst of a heart attack, he was apparently in the midst of humping a 25-year-old assistant, one Megan Marshak, in the Manhattan apartment which he had helped her purchase. So that shouldn't be too surprising, since he seemed to be interested in women other than his wife, and he didn't really care if they were married to other people, and that's pretty evident by virtue of the fact that he and Happy Rockefeller both had to divorce their current spouses in order to marry each other. I'm reminded of a friend of mine who he met his, I think, third wife. A friend of mine who lives in Las Vegas. And they met in a bar. She was married to some other guy, and she started going out with him, divorced her husband, and married him in about, maybe a year after their marriage. I know it's going to be hard to believe, she left him for some guy she met in a bar. Talking about schadenfreude. Anyhow, the point is that he couldn't believe that she would leave him for some guy she met in a bar, in spite of the fact that she left her husband to marry him after she met him in a bar. Mr. Rockefeller is not too much dissimilar from that, I think. Suggested Bible reading. Be that they will be rich, but they that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. 1 Timothy 6:9. You know, the Bible's not all bad advice. There's a little word for a lot of people. Okay, let's see here. Well, I tell you, this is such a long list. It's hard to here's one of my favorites. William Bennett. And don't let me discourage you from calling in just because I have this list of repugnance that I want to read from. I really do want to hear from our viewers on the subject of family values and value voters and exactly what kind of values we're talking about. I've given you my opinion of what I think they mean. I think they're just talking in code, basically, about really overstepping their rights in running other people's lives. But maybe I'm wrong, and I'd be happy to hear from people who think that I might be incorrect on that subject. I also want to reiterate my really serious offer. I would very much appreciate it if a couple of our viewers would call and give us some examples from, doesn't have to be Christianity, whatever, well, that's the religion, of course, that I'm most familiar with, so that would probably be the best choice. But I'd like some examples from the Bible, just a couple, as to who are the families in the Bible that we ought to pattern our own families after. And I would want to limit that, of course, to people who are born in the natural way. We would rule out anybody who has some sort of supernatural parent because certainly they're not a normal family to begin with. So they'd be disqualified for that very reason. Oops, wrong button. All right, let's talk about William Bennett. William Bennett is the former drug czar under George Bush. He was a compulsive gambler, and he apparently shot up about $1.4 million to cover his gambling losses in a 2-month period. That's a lot of money. Of course, nothing's expensive if you can afford it. I personally am not opposed to gambling. I am opposed to making a bad bet. Mr. Bennett was a slot machine player. There is no worse bet. So for that reason, I would be opposed to his activities. But I'm only pointing this out because you talk about a self-anointed moral twit. William Bennett would be right at the top of the list. He's written books on any number of subjects dealing with the morality of the United States. He appears frequently on talk shows to discuss moral positions. I have never once heard him say anything against gambling, in spite of the fact that they just passed an anti-internet gambling law a few weeks ago, which was ramrodded through the Senate by Bill Frist. So let's see here. I'm going to go down the list and pick some of the better-known names here. Here's a fairly well-known guy, John Bolton. Bush appointed him as our representative to the United Nations. He corroborated allegations that Mr. Bolton's first wife, Christina Bolton, was forced to engage in group sex. These have not been refuted by the State Department, and I have, of course, links and documentation. I'm not just making these things up. I'd be happy to provide the documentation for them, as a matter of fact. Here's another well-known name in Florida, a local boy makes good kind of story. Ted Bundy. You know, we had a quote on here, I'm sorry, it was from Dahmer, not Bundy. But I'll give you the Dahmer quote that we ran some months ago. He said that he was sure that God had put him here for a purpose, and that something to the effect that, and for the glory of God, and he would love Jesus, and so on and so forth. And then a few weeks after that, he was murdered in prison. Ted Bundy, who campaigned for the Republican Party, and of course murdered 16 women and was executed a couple of years ago in the state of Florida. All right, we'll take a little pause here from reading down this list. We're only up to the B's, and we'll talk to another caller. We're talking about family values and values voters. What the hell is that? Time's running short. All right, thanks for calling the Atheist Forum. You're live. We're talking about values voters and family values. Go ahead.
I think I have the wrong number. I'm sorry.
Okay, we'll call back anytime. All right. Well, the line is open again, so if you'd like to call in, I think the number is up on the screen. I want to remind our viewers that during the course of the evening, we will put up 2 different numbers. One number, which is the one you see now, is for the Atheist Forum. If you want to call in and you have a comment or question to make, that's the number you want to call. At other times, we'll have the Atheists of Florida number, which is a Tampa phone number also, but which will just get you an answering machine at Atheists of Florida. If you want to call Atheists of Florida, of course, you're more than welcome to do so, or send us an email, or communicate in any fashion that's reasonable. But if you want to make a comment or ask a question on the show, you want to call the number that was and is back again on the screen at this moment. All right, let's go down our list here and see who else we can find that's interesting. Well, we talked about George Bush, but we didn't mention Neil Bush. Now, Neil Bush is, of course, George's brother. He was a principal in the multi-billion-dollar collapse of the Silverado Savings and Loan in Colorado back during the savings and loan debacle. He walked away from that absolutely unscathed, as a matter of fact. There were allegations of criminal conduct. They ran off of him like Teflon, so he was very lucky in that respect. He was also divorced in 2003, and it came out during the course of the divorce trial that he had admitted repeatedly having sex with strange women. By strange, I think they mean he didn't really know them, not that they had bright red hair and tattoos. And in fact, he said that he had been on a number of Asian business trips and that women would just show up at his door at night and he would have sex with them, and he never paid any of them. He didn't know why they came or who sent them. What a life. Okay. Let's see here. Helen Chenoweth. She was a Republican from Indiana. She admitted to a 6-year adulterous affair with a married associate. She had denied the affair when asked about it, but now she claims a pardon from a higher authority. I've asked for God's forgiveness, and I've received it, she said. Which also brings up another interesting aside, and that is it's really nice for Miss Chenoweth that God has seen fit to give her forgiveness for her adulterous transgressions. Unfortunately, it really is, well, immoral to assume that you can actually be forgiven by a third party. I mean, the fact that God forgave her is no more relevant than the fact that I might forgive her. The person that needs to forgive Miss Chenoweth is the persons that she wronged, her husband and the wife of whatever man, her husband and the wife of whatever man she happened to be cavorting with at the time. Those are the people whose forgiveness she ought to ask, not God's. It doesn't matter whether God forgives her or not. And even if he does, what good does that do the people that she wronged? None, as far as I can tell. Okay, let's see what else we have here. Roy Cohn. Here's a name from the past. Roy Cohn was the legal assistant to McCarthy, Joseph McCarthy, and he was also a virulent anti-gay crusader. He died from AIDS a few years ago, which he contracted apparently from a result of a homosexual relationship. Paul Crouch. Here's a guy that maybe you know Paul Crouch, and if you do, you can't help but think of his wife. She looks like Marge Simpson in a wind tunnel. And I think that there is at this time a 6-figure reward for anybody who can find the bastard that screwed up her hair. And I hope they do. They should put the guy in jail. But Mr. Crouch is interesting because he paid $425,000. And in fact, this is documented because the guy later sued him because he wanted to write a book about it in spite of his agreement with Crouch. He paid $425,000 in hush money in an attempt to cover up a gay affair. By the way, my source for this is the magazine Christianity Today. That's right, Christianity Today. This is a magazine written by and for and about Christians. This is not some third party like the New York Times or the Philadelphia Inquirer. This is your own people pointing out your transgressions. Randy Cunningham, don't have to say too much about him. He's on his way to jail. It's unlikely that he'll ever see the free world again. He's going away, and maybe you saw him crying on television. He took, well, the 3 or 4 million that we know of in order, in the form of yachts and I think cash and so on and so forth, to steer hundreds of $millions in military contractors to people that were paying him. While we're going down the list, I'd like to pause again and remind our viewers it's a live call-in show. Our topic for the evening is basically family values, value voters, and the type of family that we would really want ours to emulate based upon the types of families that we find in the Christian Bible. So, phones are starting to ring again. That's nice. Please bear with us. We're going to take a break. As a matter of fact, it takes about 1.5 minutes. We're going to talk about Atheists of Florida. We'll be right back after the break, and we'll take some more phone calls. And let's see, we're up here to the D's. We still have about 20-some letters to go. on our list of family values from the repugnant party. Okay, are we ready? Let's roll the break.
Atheists of Florida is a nonprofit membership organization that focuses primarily on state church separation issues. Headquartered in Tampa, Florida, we have local chapters and members throughout the state. We can be reached by mail, telephone, or email. If you call us, please be sure to clearly leave your name and return phone number so that we can return your call. The preferred method of contact is by email. In this way, your contact information is documented, and this reduces errors in trying to respond to your inquiry. Comments and questions regarding atheism, this program, or the activities of Atheists of Florida are welcomed. We are committed to responding to all inquiries. Atheists of Florida regularly produces a newsletter approximately 8 times a year with news and articles of interest to members of the free thought community. A trial subscription to our newsletter is available upon request, plus we have free samples at our meetings. The newsletter is mailed to all of our members when published. Atheists of Florida holds regular monthly meetings in the Tampa Bay area at 1:30 p.m. on the second Sunday of each month. These meetings are alternated between Tampa and Pinellas Park. Our meetings are an excellent place to meet other atheists and freethinkers for conversation and fellowship. In addition, we always have informative presentations on subjects of interest to the free thought community. In addition, our meetings are an excellent place to find free thought publications. Here are some samples of items you might see on display at our meetings. We usually have a couple of tables set up to display books, pamphlets, bumper stickers, CDs, DVDs, etc., all relating to subjects of interest to atheists. Educational outreach is an important part of our mission, so we try to make sure there is plenty of literature available to answer any questions you or your friends might have. This program is just one of several educational outreach activities in which our members participate.